Maybe nobody ever told you this. The avoidant person in your life is not always running from you. Sometimes they're running from what closeness wakes up inside them. Because imagine wanting love, but feeling unsafe the moment it finally arrives. Imagine craving connection, and then feeling trapped the second someone starts depending on you. Imagine caring deeply, but feeling your nervous system panic every time intimacy becomes real. That is the part nobody sees, because avoidant people are often misunderstood, called cold, detached, emotionally unavailable. But underneath that distance, there is usually something far more painful happening. A person trying to protect themselves from closeness, while grieving the very connection they secretly want. And that contradiction, it quietly shapes everything. Because most people think avoidants don't care, that they pull away because feelings aren't deep enough, because commitment scares them, because they simply want freedom more than connection. But what if that isn't the full story? What if the distance, the silence, the sudden need for space isn't always rejection? What if sometimes it's survival? Because there is something deeply confusing about being avoidant. You can want closeness with your whole heart and still feel overwhelmed the second it becomes real. You can miss someone desperately and still ignore the message. You can love someone deeply and still feel an unbearable urge to escape when intimacy arrives. Not because you are heartless, not because you don't care, but because somewhere along the way, your nervous system learned something dangerous. Closeness is not always safe. And when that lesson gets buried deep enough, love stops feeling simple. It becomes complicated, confusing, heavy, like standing in front of something you desperately want, while every instinct inside your body tells you to run. And if you've ever been loved by someone avoidant, you know exactly how painful this can feel. Because from the outside, it looks personal. They pull away. They go quiet. They become harder to reach. And you sit there wondering, what changed? Did I ask for too much? Did I do something wrong? Why do they seem close one moment and distant the next? But the truth is, for many avoidant people, the conflict is happening long before you ever notice the distance. Because what looks like disinterest is often overwhelm. What looks like indifference is sometimes fear. And what looks like not caring can actually be someone struggling with feelings they don't know how to hold. Because here is the painful paradox of avoidance. Sometimes the people they care about the most are the exact people who activate the deepest fear. And that fear usually has roots. Roots that started long before adulthood, long before dating, long before intimacy ever entered the picture. Because for many avoidant people, closeness once came with pain, unpredictability, criticism, shame, emotional inconsistency. Maybe love felt conditional. Maybe vulnerability felt unsafe. Maybe needing people only led to disappointment. And slowly, without realizing it, the nervous system adapted. A quiet promise formed underneath everything. Never depend too much. Never need too much. Never let someone matter enough to hurt you. And at first, that adaptation feels protective. It feels strong, independent, self-sufficient. But underneath that independence, there is often grief. Because human beings are wired for connection. Even avoidant people, especially avoidant people. And this is the contradiction almost nobody talks about. Avoidants often do want closeness. They want intimacy, safety, partnership, softness. But when it starts becoming real, something inside them tightens. Their chest feels heavy. Their thoughts get louder. They start needing distance they cannot explain. And suddenly, the relationship that once felt exciting starts feeling overwhelming. Not because the love disappeared, but because vulnerability arrived. And vulnerability can feel terrifying when your nervous system learned that closeness comes with danger. Maybe pause here for a second, because if this sounds like you, I wonder how many times you called yourself difficult, cold, emotionally unavailable, when what you really were was scared, not broken, scared. And there's a difference. Picture this. You finally meet someone who feels safe. Not perfect, not dramatic, not unavailable in that intoxicating way you've learned to mistake for chemistry. Just safe. They listen. They stay. They care. And for a moment, something inside you softens. You think, maybe this time will be different. Maybe this is what closeness is supposed to feel like. But then something strange begins happening. The more they care, the more restless you become. The more consistent they are, the more overwhelmed you feel. The more available they become, the more something inside you starts quietly pulling away. And suddenly, you are confused by your own reaction. Because this is what you wanted, isn't it? Love, closeness, safety, connection. So why does your chest tighten the moment it finally arrives? Why does warmth suddenly feel suffocating? Why does being needed feel heavy? Why does intimacy feel strangely unsafe, even when the person in front of you has done nothing wrong? Maybe nobody ever told you this. The avoidant person in your life is not always running from you. Sometimes, they're running from what closeness wakes up inside them. Because imagine wanting love, but feeling unsafe the moment it finally arrives. Imagine craving connection, and then feeling trapped the second someone starts depending on you. Imagine caring deeply, but feeling your nervous system panic every time intimacy becomes real. That is the part nobody sees. Because avoidant people are often misunderstood, called cold, detached, emotionally unavailable, selfish, commitment phobic. But underneath that distance, there is often something much more painful happening. A person trying to protect themselves from closeness, while grieving the very connection they secretly want. And that contradiction? It quietly shapes everything. Because avoidance is not always about not caring. Sometimes, it is about caring so deeply that closeness feels dangerous. And to understand why, you have to understand something uncomfortable. Most avoidant people did not wake up one day and decide intimacy was frightening. Usually, their nervous system learned it very early, sometimes in homes where emotions felt unpredictable, where vulnerability was ignored, where affection came with pressure, where mistakes brought criticism, where love felt conditional. Or maybe nobody explicitly hurt them. Maybe they simply learned something quieter, that needing people led to disappointment, that depending on others created pain, that being vulnerable meant losing control. And when a child learns those lessons early enough, they adapt, not consciously, not intentionally, but neurologically, because the nervous system is designed to protect us, not necessarily to connect us. And when emotional closeness once felt unsafe, the brain becomes very good at remembering. This is why so many avoidant people experience an internal contradiction they struggle to explain. Part of them wants intimacy, deeply, but another part sees closeness as risk, not safety. Risk. Risk of disappointment, risk of dependence, risk of engulfment, risk of losing themselves, risk of eventually being hurt. So now, love starts feeling confusing. Because the closer someone gets, the louder the internal alarm becomes. And this is the part most partners misunderstand. When an avoidant person pulls away, people often assume they don't care. They've lost feelings. They're emotionally unavailable. Sometimes that's true, but many times, something much more complicated is happening because closeness itself has activated fear. and fear changes behavior. Suddenly, texts feel overwhelming. Emotional conversations feel exhausting. Commitment feels heavy. Expectations feel suffocating. Not because love is bad, but because vulnerability feels expensive. And when the nervous system feels threatened, distance starts feeling safer than intimacy. So they withdraw, maybe subtly, maybe dramatically, maybe they become quieter, maybe slower to reply, maybe less emotionally expressive. Maybe they suddenly seem unsure about the relationship, and the person loving them feels confused because nothing obvious happened. No fight, no betrayal, no catastrophe, just distance. But internally, something did happen. Closeness crossed an invisible threshold. And now the avoidant nervous system is trying to regulate itself, trying to breathe, trying to regain control, trying to create emotional space before vulnerability feels overwhelming. Because for many avoidant people, dependency does not feel romantic. It feels dangerous. And if that sounds painful, it is. Because imagine wanting love while fearing what love asks of you. Imagine meeting someone wonderful and still feeling yourself slowly retreat. Imagine caring deeply, but feeling trapped by your own instincts. This is why so many avoidant people secretly carry shame. They ask themselves questions they rarely say out loud. Why am I like this? Why do I pull away when things get serious? Why do I miss people when they leave, but panic when they stay? Why does closeness feel so overwhelming? And underneath those questions, there is often grief. Because despite what people think, many avoidant people are not enjoying the distance. They are surviving through it, protecting themselves through it, trying to regulate emotions they don't fully understand through it. And the painful irony? The very thing they crave, connection, often becomes the very thing that overwhelms them. So they create distance, then feel lonely, then miss closeness, then reconnect, then panic again. And slowly, a cycle begins, a cycle that hurts both people. The avoidant person feels misunderstood. The partner feels abandoned. And both people start blaming themselves. But before we go further, maybe pause here for a second. Because if this sounds like you, I wonder how many times you called yourself cold when what you really were was overwhelmed. How many times you thought something was wrong with you when your nervous system was simply trying to protect you. Because survival patterns can look cruel from the outside, even when they feel painful on the inside. And understanding that distinction changes everything. Because once you understand avoidance, you stop seeing distance as indifference. You start seeing it for what it often is: protection. Messy, imperfect, sometimes painful, but protection. And maybe, for the first time, you stop asking, "Why do I ruin good things?" and begin asking a different question. What made closeness feel unsafe in the first place? Because that question, that's where healing quietly begins. And what makes all of this even harder is that avoidant people rarely understand the pull happening inside them while it's happening. They only feel the overwhelm, the pressure, the urge to create distance, even when their heart is still leaning in. And that inner contradiction, it changes everything. Now, this is where things become even more confusing. Because if closeness feels unsafe for avoidant people, why do they still come close at all? Why text first? Why open up? Why say they miss you, only to disappear again? Why seem deeply invested one moment and emotionally unreachable the next? From the outside, this behavior feels contradictory, sometimes even cruel, especially if you are the one on the receiving end of it, because nothing destabilizes a relationship faster than inconsistency. One moment, they feel warm, present, connected. You feel chosen. wanted, safe. And then suddenly, something shifts. They become distant, harder to read, harder to reach. The energy changes, and you start replaying everything in your mind. Did I say something wrong? Did I ask for too much? Did they lose feelings? But this is where most people misunderstand avoidance. Because for many avoidant people, the withdrawal is not always happening because feelings disappeared. Sometimes it happens because feelings became too real, and real intimacy activates something frightening. Because closeness does something powerful, it creates emotional dependence. And emotional dependence, for someone with avoidant patterns, can feel terrifying, not romantic, not comforting, terrifying. Because dependency asks for trust, trust asks for vulnerability, and vulnerability asks them to risk something their nervous system has spent years protecting: control. This is why many avoidant people experience what psychologists often call an approach avoidance conflict, a painful internal contradiction where they deeply want connection, while simultaneously fearing what closeness might eventually cost them. Part of them leans in, part of them pulls away, at the exact same time. And if you've ever loved someone avoidant, you've probably felt trapped inside this contradiction. Because just when intimacy begins feeling real, distance appears. You finally feel close, and suddenly they need space. You begin building consistency, and suddenly they seem uncertain. You express love, and suddenly they feel overwhelmed. And none of it makes sense until you understand this. Avoidant people are often not reacting to the relationship itself. They're reacting to what intimacy activates inside them. Because love, real love, creates exposure. Now someone matters. Now there is something to lose. Now disappointment becomes possible. Now abandonment becomes possible. Now being truly seen becomes possible. And for an avoidant nervous system, that level of emotional exposure can feel dangerously vulnerable. So something inside them starts whispering, "This is too much. Slow down. You're losing yourself. You need space. What if this ends badly? What if they expect too much? What if you disappoint them? What if they leave first?" And suddenly, distance feels safer than intimacy. Again, this is why the push-pull dynamic feels so painful. Because the avoidant person is not always choosing between closeness and distance. Often, they are desperately trying to regulate the anxiety closeness creates, without even realizing that's what they're doing. Sometimes the distance is subtle. They text less, share less, feel harder to reach emotionally. Sometimes they become hyper-focused on work, responsibilities, personal goals, anything that restores a feeling of emotional independence. And sometimes, they unconsciously start looking for flaws. Tiny things suddenly feel bigger. The relationship feels off. They begin wondering if something is missing, not because the relationship is bad, but because emotional closeness itself feels unfamiliar. And unfamiliar things can feel unsafe. This is something psychologists sometimes refer to as deactivation strategies, ways the nervous system reduces emotional intensity when intimacy starts feeling overwhelming. Without realizing it, the avoidant brain starts creating distance to restore safety, maybe emotionally, maybe physically, maybe mentally, but distance nonetheless. And here is the painful irony. While the avoidant person is pulling away to feel safe, the person loving them usually responds by moving closer, asking questions, seeking reassurance, trying harder, wanting clarity, wanting connection, which makes perfect sense because emotional inconsistency activates anxiety, especially in relationships. But to the avoidant nervous system, that increased closeness can feel like pressure. not love, pressure. And now the cycle intensifies. One person reaches, one person retreats, one person fears abandonment, the other fears engulfment. One person says, "Please stay close." The other quietly thinks, "Please give me room to breathe." And neither person fully understands what is happening. They only feel hurt, misunderstood, exhausted. Maybe pause here for a second, because if this sounds painfully familiar, I wonder how many times you blamed yourself for someone else's withdrawal. How many nights you stayed awake wondering what changed. How many times you convinced yourself, if I just love them better, if I just become easier to love, maybe they'll stop pulling away. But here's the difficult truth. You cannot love someone out of survival patterns they have not learned to recognize themselves. And if you are the avoidant person listening to this, I wonder how many times you hated yourself for leaving emotionally, while still secretly hoping someone would understand why. How many times you missed someone, while convincing yourself distance was necessary. How many times you wanted closeness, but could not quiet the panic that came with it. Because underneath avoidance, there is often grief. Grief for the relationships that almost worked. Grief for the people you cared about but couldn't stay fully close to. Grief for the version of yourself that longs to feel safe inside intimacy, but still doesn't quite know how. And maybe the hardest part? Most avoidant people don't even realize this pattern is happening while it's happening. They just feel overwhelmed, trapped, restless, emotionally crowded. So they leave, or shut down, or disconnect emotionally, only to feel lonely later, only to miss the closeness once the pressure fades. And then something confusing happens. They return, not always because they changed, but because distance has regulated the nervous system again. Now closeness feels safe, until it becomes too close. And the cycle repeats, again, and again, and again, until someone finally asks a painful question. Is this actually love? Or are we both trapped inside each other's wounds? Because understanding the push-pull dynamic means understanding something heartbreaking. Sometimes two people can care deeply about one another and still not know how to make closeness feel safe. And that reality? It quietly breaks more relationships than most people realize. But what hurts avoidant people in ways they rarely admit is what this pattern slowly teaches them to believe about themselves. Because after enough relationships begin the same way, and in the same way, something painful starts happening inside the avoidant person. They stop only questioning relationships and start questioning themselves, quietly, privately, in ways most people never see. Because underneath the distance, underneath the silence, underneath the sudden need for space, there is often a shame that rarely gets spoken out loud, a quiet fear that whispers, maybe I'm just too difficult to love. Maybe something is wrong with me. Maybe I ruin everything good. And this is the part most people misunderstand. Avoidant people often look emotionally self-contained, independent, unbothered, like they simply move on. But internally, many are carrying far more guilt than anyone realizes. Because contrary to what people assume, many avoidants remember everything. The relationships, the conversations, the people they hurt, the texts they never answered, the moments they withdrew, the person they cared about, but somehow still pushed away. And sometimes, they replay it all privately, wondering why closeness always becomes complicated, wondering why their chest tightens the moment something healthy begins, wondering why intimacy feels beautiful, right until it starts feeling unbearable. Because here is something avoidant people rarely say out loud. Many of them are terrified of becoming a burden, not just abandoned, a burden, a disappointment, too emotionally complicated, too difficult to understand, too hard to love consistently. So instead of asking for reassurance, they withdraw. Instead of expressing fear, they become quiet. Instead of saying, I'm overwhelmed, they say, I just need space. Instead of admitting, I'm scared of being hurt, they convince themselves, maybe this relationship just isn't right. And sometimes they genuinely believe it because the nervous system is persuasive. When closeness feels threatening, the brain starts creating explanations, reasons, logic, stories that make distance feel justified. Maybe they suddenly focus on flaws. Maybe intimacy feels too much. Maybe they convince themselves something is missing, not because love disappeared, but because emotional vulnerability activated fear. And fear is very convincing when it speaks. This is why avoidant people can seem confusing even to themselves. One day they miss you. The next day they feel overwhelmed by your presence. One moment they want closeness. The next moment they feel trapped by it. One day they long for intimacy. The next day they feel emotionally crowded. And imagine how exhausting that must feel to crave something deeply while constantly feeling unsafe inside it. Because underneath avoidance, there is often hypervigilance, a nervous system constantly scanning, not always for connection, but for danger. Tiny changes feel significant. Expectations feel heavy. Conflict feels threatening. Dependence feels risky. Even emotional closeness itself can feel overstimulating. And slowly, relationships begin feeling less like comfort and more like emotional pressure. Not because the other person is doing anything wrong, but because intimacy itself activates old protective wiring. This is why many avoidants secretly wish people understood something difficult. Their distance is not always rejection. Sometimes, distance is regulation. Sometimes they are trying to calm themselves, trying to think, trying to breathe, trying to stop the overwhelm they don't know how to explain. And yes, sometimes that hurts people deeply because loving someone who disappears emotionally can feel devastating. But understanding the internal experience changes the conversation because suddenly, what looked like indifference starts looking more like fear, messy fear, protective fear, fear disguised as independence. And maybe this is also why so many avoidant people feel misunderstood. Because people usually only see the behavior, not the internal war. They see the delayed reply, the emotional distance, the canceled plans, the inconsistency, the walls. But they don't see the overthinking, the guilt, the panic, the loneliness, the self-criticism, the quiet moments of wondering, why can't I just let people love me? Maybe pause here for a second, because if this sounds like you, I wonder how many times you convinced yourself you were cold, when what you really felt was overwhelmed. How many times you thought you were incapable of love, when maybe you were simply terrified of what love could take away. Because sometimes the people who seem the most emotionally distant are the ones fighting the hardest battle internally, not against love, but against what love wakes up inside them. And perhaps the deepest misunderstanding of all is this idea that avoidant people don't care, because many care deeply, sometimes too deeply. They just learned early that needing people came with consequences, that closeness could hurt, that vulnerability could cost them something. So now, their nervous system protects first and trusts later, if trust comes at all. But here is the tragedy in that. Protection can keep pain out, yes, but it can also keep intimacy out. And after enough time, many avoidant people begin noticing something painful. The independence they worked so hard to protect starts feeling lonely. The distance feels quieter than they expected. Relationships feel harder to sustain. The people who once tried slowly stop trying, and eventually, they are left with a painful question. Did I actually want freedom, or was I just afraid? Because there comes a moment, sometimes after heartbreak, sometimes after loss, sometimes after someone finally stops coming back, when the avoidant person starts realizing something difficult. Maybe the walls protected them, but maybe those same walls also kept love standing outside. And that realization, it hurts. Because once you finally see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. You start noticing the exits you created, the vulnerability you avoided, the people you cared about, but struggled to let fully in. And that's usually when another question begins quietly forming. Can I actually change this? Can closeness ever stop feeling threatening? Can someone like me really learn to feel safe and love? Because despite what people believe, avoidance is not a life sentence, but healing it requires something most avoidant people have spent years protecting themselves from. And that changes everything. And maybe this is the part nobody tells avoidant people enough. The fact that you learn to protect yourself does not mean you are impossible to love. It only means your nervous system learned survival before it ever learned safety. Because after enough disappointment, after enough moments where closeness felt confusing, heavy, or emotionally overwhelming, distance starts feeling like the safer option. Not because you want to be alone, but because alone feels predictable, and predictable feels safe. That is the contradiction most people never understand about avoidance. The avoidant person is not always choosing distance because they do not care. Sometimes they are choosing distance because caring feels terrifying, because caring means vulnerability, and vulnerability feels dangerously close to loss. So what happens? You learn how to manage connection. You ration closeness. You control distance. You tell yourself things like, I just need space. I'm overwhelmed. I don't want anything serious right now. And sometimes, those things feel true. But underneath them, there is often something quieter happening. A nervous system whispering, please do not let this hurt again. Because avoidance rarely begins with arrogance. It begins with fear. Fear of rejection. Fear of disappointment. Fear of being consumed. Fear of losing yourself inside someone else's expectations. And when those fears live in the body long enough, they stop feeling like fears. They start feeling like personality. This is just who I am. I'm not relationship material. I'm better alone. But sometimes, those beliefs are not identity. Sometimes, they are protection. And protection feels permanent until someone finally teaches your nervous system that closeness does not always end in pain. Because healing for avoidant people rarely begins the way most people think. It does not begin with suddenly becoming emotionally open overnight. It does not begin with forcing vulnerability. And it definitely does not begin with someone demanding, just let me in. Healing begins much smaller than that, quieter, safer. It begins with noticing. Noticing the moment you want to shut down. Noticing the urge to disappear. Noticing the story your mind tells the second someone gets too close. Maybe they'll leave. Maybe they'll need too much. Maybe I'll disappoint them. Maybe I'll lose myself. And instead of automatically obeying that fear, you pause, even for a moment, and you ask yourself something different. Is this danger? Or is this familiarity? Because sometimes, what feels safe is simply what feels familiar. And for many avoidant people, distance became familiar long before intimacy ever had a chance. Maybe pause here for a second, because if this sounds like you, I wonder how many times you called yourself cold when what you really were was overwhelmed. How many times you convinced yourself you didn't care when secretly you cared too much. How many times you walked away from connection, not because it meant nothing, but because it meant too much. That deserves compassion, not shame, because shame has never healed avoidance. Understanding does. Safety does. Gentleness does. And no, this does not mean every avoidant relationship survives. Sometimes people leave. Sometimes trust breaks. Sometimes the distance becomes too painful for both people. That part matters too, because love still requires accountability. Healing does not mean expecting someone else to endlessly tolerate inconsistency. And understanding avoidance does not mean abandoning your own needs, but it does mean this. The story is not hopeless, because avoidant people can heal. Slowly, awkwardly, imperfectly, but genuinely. Especially when awareness enters the room. Especially when someone becomes brave enough to ask, what am I actually protecting myself from? And what might happen if I stopped assuming closeness automatically ends in pain? Because underneath so much avoidance, there is often something heartbreakingly human. Someone who wanted love, someone who wanted safety, someone who learned very early that needing people came with consequences. And maybe for the first time, they are trying to learn a new story. One where closeness does not equal losing yourself. One where intimacy is not weakness. One where love does not have to feel like pressure, just presence. Steady, safe, unforced. And maybe the real question is not, can avoidant people love? Maybe the real question is, what happens when someone who spent their whole life protecting themselves finally experiences a kind of love that no longer feels dangerous? Because sometimes healing does not begin when fear disappears. Sometimes healing begins when someone stays long enough, including yourself, to prove that closeness can finally feel safe. And if this resonated, I want to ask you something. What is one thing you wish people understood about why avoidant people pull away? Or, if you love someone avoidant, what part finally started making sense today? Leave it in the comments. Because sometimes the thing that helps people heal most is realizing they are not the only one carrying this story. And if you're learning how to build healthier connection with yourself or with someone you love, stay close. There's more here for you.